In the stillness of the early morning, long before the sun touched the snow-blanketed fields of Bitter Creek, Grace Holloway moved quietly through the frozen silence of the Pine Hollow stables. Her breath hung in the air like smoke, and each step crunched softly beneath her boots. The horses stirred gently as she passed, whispering recognition in low grunts and snorts. She paused beside Silver Ghost's stall, her hand brushing over his silken mane. "You always know, don't you?" she murmured. The horse snorted again, watching her with calm, intelligent eyes. Behind her, a voice cracked the silence like a whip. "Grace." She stiffened instantly. No warmth, no hesitation. Just her name, spoken like a summons. She turned slowly. Richard D. Whitmore stood in the doorway, his coat open despite the cold, boots still clean from a truck ride. 55, silver-templed, and statuesque in the way of men who always knew they'd win. His presence filled the space. His eyes were steel, always watching, always judging. "You didn't come up last night," he said flatly. "I wasn't feeling well," she replied carefully. "I stayed in bed." He stepped forward. "That's not your decision to make." Grace flinched as he approached, instinctively drawing her coat tighter around her. His gaze drifted downward, pausing at her stomach. It was just beginning to show, a soft curve beneath the layers. He'd noticed. "You're starting to look obvious." "I told you weeks ago," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't want to talk about it then." He smiled. But it wasn't kind. It was that familiar, quiet mockery he wore like cologne. "And what do you want now? A nursery in the guest house? A public announcement?" "No," she said quickly. I thought we agreed." "We agreed you'd be smart," he interrupted. "Discreet. Loyal." "I have been." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It was meant to look tender." "It wasn't. Don't confuse loyalty with entitlement, Grace. This little situation? It's an inconvenience. For both of us." Her throat tightened. "They're not a situation. They're lives. They're your children." Richard laughed, low and disdainful. "Children? You really believe this fairy tale you've built? Let me be clear. I have a life. A family. A reputation. You are a secret, and I've tolerated it for far too long." Something hardened in Grace's eyes. She folded her arms. "You said you loved me." "I said what you needed to hear," he said coolly. "You were a good distraction. That's all." She blinked. Just once. But it was enough for him to see that his words landed exactly where he wanted. Then he leaned in, his voice turning low and venomous. "I pulled you out of nothing. You'd be sweeping floors in some gas station if it weren't for me. You eat because of me. You live here because of me. And now you want to ruin me." "I never said that," she murmured, feeling the nausea rise again. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Then listen carefully," he said, stepping back. "You're going to fix this. Quietly. I don't care how. If you make this public, if anyone finds out, your life ends here. I'll make sure you never find work again in this county or the next. You'll be a black single mother in rural Montana. Think about how that's going to play out." He turned and began walking toward the main house. She called after him. "Richard, I can't do this alone. They're twins. He stopped without turning around. "You already are alone, Grace. You just don't realize it yet." Then he vanished into the snow, leaving only boot prints behind. Later that evening, as Grace sat on the porch of her modest cottage near the horse paddocks, a heavy blanket over her shoulders, she stared into the darkness. The cold wind pushed against the wooden boards, and the ache in her back told her the babies were coming sooner than she expected. She thought of her mother, who died when she was 15, of Atlanta, and how different her life might have been if she'd stayed. But most of all, she thought of the lies she'd lived these past years. How many times had she convinced herself he'd change? That she mattered? Her phone vibrated. "Richard, one new message. Be ready tomorrow night. I'll drive you into Bozeman. I found a clinic that doesn't ask questions." Her hands shook. The words hit her like a blow to the chest. A clinic. Not a hospital. Not a doctor. Just another way to erase her. To back. "Grace, I'm already almost 8 months. I can't. It's too late for that. His reply was immediate. Richard, then it'll have to be something else. We'll figure it out. But one way or another, this ends quietly. She didn't respond. At the main house, Richard poured himself a scotch, staring out at the barn through the frost-laced window. The light in Grace's cottage glowed dimly, like a flame about to go out. You should have been smarter, he muttered to himself. You should have known your place. Then, as if conjured by the thought, Silver Ghost gave a single, loud, echoing whinny, a sharp cry that pierced the night. Richard frowned. The horse was watching him. From across the field, through the dark, through the glass. And something about it made him uneasy. By the next night, the wind was slicing through Bitter Creek like a blade, carrying with it the promise of a snowstorm. The kind that silenced everything: roads, houses, people. Grace stood by the fence, her gloved hands resting against the worn wood, eyes scanning the treeline that framed the property. She hadn't slept. The ache in her lower back had grown into something sharper, more insistent. Her breathing had started to come in waves. She knew what that meant. But when Richard's truck headlights cut through the dusk, her body betrayed her with a shiver, not from cold, but dread. He rolled the window down. Get in. There was no please. No? How are you feeling? Just that voice, worn like leather. Used, commanding, utterly indifferent. Grace hesitated. I need to go to a hospital, Richard. This isn't. You'll go where I take you, he cut her off. Get in the damn truck. For a long, silent moment, she stared at him. Then, slowly, she climbed into the passenger seat. The heat blasted against her frozen cheeks, but it brought no comfort. They drove for 20 minutes without a word. Snow began to fall, softly at first, then faster. Grace glanced down at her phone, but there was no signal. They were well past the county road now. Just dirt and ice and sky. She looked at him. Where are we going? He didn't answer. Her heart pounded. Richard. I told you, he said, voice flat. Somewhere quiet. They turned off onto an unmarked trail, headlights bouncing over stones and frozen roots. Trees closed in on either side like walls. Grace's breath grew shallow. You said you'd help me, she whispered. I'm helping you. By not letting this ruin your life, or mine. You're abandoning me. I'm giving you a chance to figure it out without dragging my name through the mud. You should thank me. Grace stared at him in disbelief. You're sick. And you're naive, he replied, shifting gears as they climbed. You think this place runs on virtue? On charity? No, Grace. It runs on control, reputation, power. The minute someone like you forgets that, everything burns. The truck stopped near an old, half-collapsed wooden hunting shack, a place Richard used decades ago during elk season. Now it was barely more than a shelter. A few planks. A broken chimney. Snow already covered half the roof. You'll stay here tonight, he said. Storm will pass. You'll figure something out. She turned to him, wide-eyed. I could die out here. You won't. I'm in labor, Richard. Not my problem anymore. He opened the glove compartment, pulled out 2 thin emergency blankets, a flashlight, and a granola bar. This should hold you till morning. She didn't move. You're serious, she said, her voice breaking. He didn't look at her. You'll be fine. You're stronger than you look. You're a monster. Say what you want. Just don't say it where people can hear you. He stepped out, walked around the truck, and opened her door. Grace sat frozen. Out, he said. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she refused to let him see the rest. She forced herself out of the truck, leaning heavily against the side to stay upright. The pain in her abdomen was coming in waves now. You'll regret this, she said softly. Richard smiled coldly. Doubt it. And with that, he drove away, taillights vanishing into the swirling snow like a phantom. It wasn't long before the pain swallowed her. Grace stumbled into the hunting shack, wrapped in the 2 pitiful blankets, her body racked with spasms of cold and contractions. The flashlight flickered against the rotting walls, the floor creaking beneath her as she lowered herself onto a torn sleeping bag someone had left behind. She screamed into the dark. No one heard. Back at the ranch, Silver Ghost was restless. He had broken out before. Quietly. Grace was always the one who found him grazing calmly by the fence or wandering the pasture. But tonight, no one noticed until he was already gone, his silver coat a blur against the white horizon. He followed the truck's scent. The same scent he'd known since a foal. But it wasn't Richard he was tracking now. It was her. Morning broke over Bitter Creek slowly, pale, gray, and cold. Snow had blanketed the roads, isolating the town from the outside world. At the edge of town, Maggie Boone, 63, opened her cabin door with an irritated grunt. She'd lived alone for years, by choice. People in Bitter Creek had a way of smiling to your face and burying your story 6 feet under when you turned your back. But today was different. Something was wrong. She saw the tracks first, hooves. Fresh, erratic. And then the figure. A horse. Silver Ghost. Covered in ice and breathing hard, the stallion stood just past her porch, his body tense, his eyes wide. He wasn't running. He was waiting. Maggie stepped closer, hesitant. What the hell? Then he neighed, long, mournful, urgent. Maggie had seen a lot in her life. Enough to know when something wasn't natural. She grabbed her coat and keys. It took nearly 2 hours to follow the tracks through the snow. The farther she drove into the trees, the worse the storm had been. But when she found the shack, the engine of her SUV nearly died from the cold. She opened the door, heart pounding. Hello. Then the sound. A faint cry. Maggie ran. Inside the shack, barely conscious, Grace lay curled with 2 newborns against her chest, their skin blue and shivering. Maggie gasped. Oh my God. She dropped to her knees and pulled the blankets tighter around them. You're okay now, she whispered, voice shaking. I got you. Grace opened her eyes, barely able to speak. Don't let him bury me too. Maggie froze. And in that moment, everything changed. 2 days after Grace Holloway was rescued, the town of Bitter Creek changed. Subtly, then all at once. At first, the official story from the Whitmore Ranch was simple. Grace had gone missing during the storm. Richard, in interviews, expressed deep concern for her safety, claiming she had been troubled and had likely wandered off in confusion. He even issued a statement through the sheriff's office offering a reward for any information about her whereabouts. What he hadn't expected was that Grace would survive. She was taken to the Bitter Creek Regional Hospital, her body dangerously cold, her twins born early but breathing. Maggie Boone refused to leave her side. She'd watched the doctors work on Grace with a rage simmering just beneath her wrinkled composure, a fury that had been silent for decades. You knew him, didn't you? Grace asked her the next morning, her voice rasping. Maggie didn't answer at first. She just stared out the window, watching the pine trees sway under heavy skies. I was supposed to marry him, she said at last. 40 years ago. Grace blinked, startled. I was 18, Maggie went on. Naive. I saw the charm, the money, the attention. He was already being groomed as the next king of Bitter Creek. My father called it a golden match. But you didn't marry him. I found a letter, she said, voice low. From a housemaid. A black girl. Younger than me. She was pregnant. Grace's heart twisted. I confronted him. He didn't deny it. Just said, she misunderstood the arrangement. That phrase, I'll never forget it. He said it like it was business. And the girl? She disappeared. Next week. Left behind a bag and half a diary. Everyone said she'd run off. But I always knew. Grace's voice trembled. Her name. Do you remember her name? Maggie nodded. Delilah. Delilah Sharp. The name spread like smoke. Delilah Sharp. A teenager who'd once worked summers at Pine Hollow, disappeared in 1985. No police report ever filed. No investigation. Her mother, a house cleaner in the town, had died 2 years later of a heart attack. Or so people said. But the name had echoes. It rang inside Bitter Creek like a buried bell. And then came the proof. Travis Miller, 39, had worked maintenance at Pine Hollow for over a decade. He kept to himself. But when the story broke about Grace, and when his own sister started asking questions, he remembered something. In an old shed behind the southern barn, beneath 3 rusted saddles, lay a box. He hadn't touched it in years. But when he opened it now, dust rising, he found what he'd tucked away and forgotten. A cloth-bound journal, with the initials DS burned faintly into the cover. He flipped through its yellowed pages. The last few entries were stained with water, but still legible. He promised to buy me a ticket to Billings. Said I'd get set up. Said he'd call me every day. But I heard him laughing with the others tonight. Said I was handled. Like a pest. I think he's going to get rid of me. Travis sat down on the floor, hands shaking. Maggie gave the journal to Sheriff Carl Breyer herself. Carl was old enough to remember Delilah Sharp. Young enough to still be afraid of Richard Whitmore. "I'll need to authenticate this," he said, clearing his throat. "You need to stop protecting him," Maggie replied coldly. "This isn't just about Grace. It never was. You know how many women worked that ranch alone, desperate, invisible?" Carl looked down. "If you don't move," she added, "I will." That week, news reached Helena, then Billings. And soon after, the story made it to regional networks. A feature ran on Channel 12, The Hollow Truth, Race, Power, and Silence in Bitter Creek. Richard's image, once revered, almost sacred, began to erode in public view. A still photo of Grace in her hospital bed, holding her premature twins, circulated online. Below it, a quote, "He left me to die. But I didn't." The town split like an old tree. Some still defended him. Loyal ranchers, old money, bitter men with investments in the myth of Richard D. Whitmore. But others, quietly at first, began to come forward. 2 former workers filed statements. One, a Mexican woman named Ana Luz Jimenez, who said she'd been touched and dismissed after refusing his advances in 2009. Another, a white girl named Bethany Cole, who claimed Richard offered to pay for her mother's surgery if she'd spend a few nights at the main house. She'd run away instead. Richard's world began to shrink. He fired 3 employees who spoke to the press. He tried to sue the local paper. He threatened Maggie through his lawyer. But nothing stuck. The tide was too strong. And then came the blow that cracked everything wide open. Sheriff Breyer called a press conference. "We are reopening the 1985 case of Delilah Sharp," he said, his voice measured, eyes shadowed. "We have new evidence suggesting foul play. The Whitmore family has been contacted. Richard D. Whitmore is now under official investigation." Reporters swarmed. Richard refused to comment. But the next morning, the FBI arrived in Bitter Creek. And Pine Hollow no longer belonged to him. Grace was discharged 1 week later. Maggie drove her and the twins home, not to the shack, not to the ranch, but to her own house. A safe place. Silver Ghost had not left the front yard since that first night. He grazed peacefully, but any time a man approached Grace, he would lift his head sharply. "He's watching," Maggie said, smirking. "He remembers," Grace whispered, stroking his mane. He knew the truth when no one else did. One night, as Grace watched the babies sleep, a car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't Richard. It was his son. Luke Whitmore, 29, tall, thin, with tired eyes. He removed his cap as he approached. "I'm sorry to come here," he said. Grace stood in the doorway, cautious. "I need to tell you something," he continued, "about my father. And Delilah." Inside, with Maggie nearby, Luke told them everything. He had found the rest of Delilah's journal hidden in the attic of the old hay house. She had written about being kept in a guest room, isolated. About other girls. About a warning from a woman named M, likely Maggie, from her own engagement days. But the last entry chilled them all. "I saw something I shouldn't have. In the shed. A red scarf. Blood. He told me to forget it. I told him I wouldn't. I think he's going to kill me." Maggie covered her mouth. Grace stared ahead, breathing shallow. "She was right," Luke said. "He did kill her. Or had someone do it. I know it." "And now?" Grace asked quietly. Luke looked at her, eyes glassy. "Now I help you bring him down. I don't want his name. I don't want his ranch. I want justice. The trial hadn't started yet, but in Bitter Creek, Richard D. Whitmore was already a condemned man. The day federal agents escorted him from the Whitmore Ranch in handcuffs, the local news station went live for nearly 6 hours straight. Residents gathered silently in front of Main Street Cafe, watching the flat-screen TV bolted above the counter like they were witnessing a war report. No one spoke. No one cheered. It wasn't victory. It was reckoning. Grace watched the footage from Maggie's couch, her babies cradled against her chest. The camera caught Richard's face as he stepped into the police vehicle, jaw set, no visible regret. Not shame. Not fear. Just fury. He's still thinking about how to win, she said quietly. Maggie sat beside her, eyes locked on the screen. Some men die without ever realizing they lost. The twins stirred. Grace kissed their heads gently. I don't want them to carry this, she whispered. His name. His shadow. I want them to grow up free of it. You're the one who gives them that, Maggie said. Not him. In the days that followed, Bitter Creek changed in ways small and seismic. The sheriff's office issued an apology, not just for failing to investigate Grace's disappearance, but for the decades of silence surrounding Delilah Sharp and others like her. A plaque was erected in front of the town library with Delilah's name, and a candlelight vigil was held in the snow-covered park. Grace didn't attend. Not because she didn't care, but because she wasn't ready. Instead, she stayed home with her children. She fed them, bathed them, whispered to them under the covers. You were not a mistake, she told them softly. You are the proof I survived. Luke Whitmore came by every few days. He never stayed long. Just enough to drop off legal updates, documents, and boxes of old photos he'd been digging out of the Whitmore estate. Grace never asked him to stay. She didn't trust him. Not fully. But she saw something different in him. Maybe guilt. Maybe grief. Maybe a kind of hunger for redemption that had nowhere else to go. One morning, as they stood on Maggie's porch, Luke handed her a small envelope. This is for a DNA test, he said. To prove paternity. The lawyers said you'd need it for full custody and financial claim. Grace nodded. You're willing to do this? I'm not doing it for my father, he said. I'm doing it because they deserve to be acknowledged. Legally. Publicly. No more secrets. She took the envelope but didn't thank him. Some wounds didn't close with paperwork. Weeks later, the test came back positive. Richard D. Whitmore was, undeniably, the biological father of Grace's children. Her legal team, volunteers from a women's justice organization based in Missoula, began the process of filing civil claims. For paternity, for damages, for child support, and eventually, for wrongful endangerment. There were whispers that the ranch might have to be sold. Grace didn't care about the money, but she knew this. If the land was auctioned, she'd bid for one piece of it. The back paddock, where Silver Ghost waited for her every morning, breath misting in the air like prayer. At the hospital, Grace volunteered to speak with a group of teenage girls brought in from surrounding rural towns. Survivors of abuse, foster care, homelessness. No cameras. No headlines. Just Grace sitting in a circle with them. You don't owe silence to anyone, she said. Not to men with power. Not to families who protect their image. Not to anyone who tells you, this is just the way things are. That's a lie people tell you to keep you small. A girl in the back, maybe 15, raised her hand. Are you afraid? Of him? Of what comes next? Grace smiled gently. I'm more afraid of staying invisible. Meanwhile, public opinion splintered bitterly. Old ranchers grumbled in bars about women making things up and tearing down legacies. Others finally spoke aloud the thoughts they'd kept for years, how the town had always bent over backwards for Richard, how men like him built fortresses out of silence and money. New editorials appeared in the local paper, this time with titles like The Cost of Looking Away and Reckoning at Pine Hollow. The mayor gave a stiff, reluctant statement of support for the investigation, clearly terrified of what else might emerge. Maggie, ever the sharper tongue, had her own response. They're not afraid of justice, she said to Grace over tea. They're afraid the town's real story is finally being told. Then came the night when Grace stood in front of the property lines of the ranch. Luke had invited her. "Come see it one more time," he said. She almost said no. But something inside her, maybe strength, maybe vengeance, said go. So she did. She walked through the front gates, past the main house where she used to sneak in after dark, past the stable where Silver Ghost waited for her with a whinny and soft nudge, past the shack in the back, now boarded up and marked with yellow tape, where Delilah's final words had echoed across the decades. And there, beneath the biggest oak tree on the land, Luke handed her something. An old Polaroid. It showed a younger Richard, his arm wrapped around a girl with dark skin and nervous eyes. On the back, in faded ink, "Me and D, July '85. Grace looked at it for a long time. Then she tore it in half. Spring arrived late in Bitter Creek that year. The snow clung to the hills until April, and even then, it melted with hesitation, as if the land wasn't ready to thaw. But the people were. On the first warm morning of the season, Grace stood before the county courthouse with her attorney and a folded piece of paper in her hand. Her twins were home with Maggie, who had grown into the role of grandmother like she'd been waiting her whole life for it. The paper was official. Custody awarded. Paternity confirmed. Monthly compensation for damages and care. More than that, though, it came with a name change. The boys would carry her name, not his. Whitmore meant silence, cruelty, shadows. Holloway meant survival. That was the name they would learn to walk with. "I don't need his money," she told the attorney afterward, "but I'll take every last dollar to feed them, clothe them, educate them, and remind him what it costs to try and erase someone." The trial for Richard D. Whitmore began in June. It wasn't just about Grace or Delilah. It became a case that unearthed nearly 4 decades of unchecked power. Women, now older, some with families of their own, flew back to Montana just to testify. Each story chipped away at the image Richard had built. Polished. Marketed. The courtroom was packed every day. But Grace only went once. She sat in the back row, unseen. She listened as Richard's voice broke on the stand, trying to explain away a lifetime of calculated cruelty. He blamed his upbringing, his ambition, his enemies. He never blamed himself. When it was over, Grace stepped outside and didn't look back. She didn't need to hear the sentence. She'd already won. The Whitmore Ranch was sold in parcels. Investors came sniffing. Developers made offers. But Luke, still estranged from his father, still searching for a better version of himself, brokered a deal Grace never expected. He offered her one piece of the land for free. "I don't want it," he said. "But I want you to." She didn't answer right away. She walked the field first, felt the dirt under her boots, listened to the silence. Then finally she nodded. "I'll take it." She built a barn there. Small but strong. 2 stalls, a tack room, and a pasture that glowed gold in the mornings. And at the center of it all, Silver Ghost, older now but still proud, still watchful, wandered freely, his silver mane catching the breeze like a flag of memory. Grace didn't become famous. She didn't write a book or go on talk shows. That was never what she wanted. But her name was known now. Respected. At the annual Bitter Creek County Fair, she was asked to judge the Youth Equestrian Showcase. A girl, 11, maybe 12, rode a chestnut pony nervously around the arena. Afterward, Grace knelt beside her and said, "You held your own. That matters more than a ribbon." The girl beamed. Legacy wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was a quiet seed planted in someone else's courage. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Grace sat on her porch watching the twins toddle barefoot through the grass. Their laughter floated through the air, soft and pure. One of them pointed to Silver Ghost, who stood nearby grazing lazily. "Mommy, he's watching us again." Grace smiled. "He always does." The boy ran to the fence and hugged the horse's leg gently, giggling. Silver Ghost bowed his head, brushing his nose against the child's hair. That night, as the boys fell asleep in their shared bed, Grace tucked the old blanket around them and whispered, "You came into this world through fire, but you live in light now. That's what matters." A few weeks later, Maggie passed away quietly in her sleep. She was buried beneath the same oak tree that once held the weight of Bitter Creek's secrets. Grace gave the eulogy. "She saved me," she said. "But more than that, she made sure I didn't disappear. And now I promise to do the same. For others. For my boys. For the truth." After the ceremony, Grace stood alone by the grave. The wind moved gently through the branches above her. And for a moment, she thought she heard Delilah's name whispered through the leaves. Years later, long after Richard Whitmore's obituary had faded from relevance, a little museum opened in town. It wasn't large. Just 2 rooms. But one wall held photographs and names. Women who had lived, worked, struggled, and vanished without ever being truly seen. At the center of the display was a simple brass plaque. "For every woman who was told to be quiet, we remember. We speak." And just beneath it, 2 small handprints pressed into a block of cement. Twins. Holloway boys. Sons of survival. Children of a future that would not repeat the past.